Now, for the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Patricia Ranald, and I'm the coordinator of the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network.
Now, would you like to make a brief opening statement before we go to questions?
Would. I've actually got a summary of our submission, which was published in the Canberra Times this morning, and I've got copies of it here, if that would be useful to the committee.
Table that, that'll be fine.
And I'll just make the main points from that. Just to begin with, we're a network of community organisations, including church, environment, union, public health, pensioner, all kinds of organisations concerned about the social impact of trade agreements. And I personally have a PhD in international relations dealing with trade agreements and have been making submissions about trade agreements for about 20 years. Our submission deals with the specific case for a more open process for trade agreements as distinct from other treaties. Not that we don't want it to be more open for other treaties, but we're dealing with trade agreements because that's what the committee is specifically looking at. And the key thing about trade agreements is that they are legally binding on current and future governments, but they are negotiated in secret. And the reason that people have become more concerned about this over the last decade or so is that trade agreements actually deal with a much broader range of issues, not just reductions in tariffs. So if you take the TPP, it's dealing with a very wide range of domestic law and policy. So we've heard already that pharmaceutical companies want stronger patents on medicines, which would delay the availability of cheaper generic medicines. Media companies want longer copyright payments, and you've heard a lot about that and restrictions on internet use and so on. You've heard about that from previous witnesses. Food, alcohol and tobacco companies want to influence government regulation in all of those areas. And in the TPP, the US is very much driving the negotiations on behalf of their major export industries, which these companies are active in. And they all want special rights for foreign investors to be able to sue governments for damages over domestic law and policy, known as ISDS. And of course, this is a system which doesn't have an independent judiciary, and it doesn't have appeals or precedents. So, and there's been increasing numbers of ISDS cases which have dealt with or challenged or sought compensation for environmental law, health law, even in the case of Veolia suing Egypt, industrial relations law. So our argument is that since trade agreements are now dealing with all these issues that would normally be decided through a democratic process, an open democratic process domestically involving public discussion and parliamentary legislation, then the trade agreement process needs to be a lot more open. At the moment, it's a cabinet process. Cabinet manages the negotiations, and the text is not revealed until there's been a decision to sign the agreement by cabinet. Only then does it go to the JSCOT and is reviewed, tabled in Parliament, becomes public, is reviewed by JSCOT, but the text actually can't be changed, and Parliament only gets to vote on the implementing legislation, not on the whole text of the agreement. But there's actually a whole lot in the text that's very important that Parliament doesn't get to vote on. So, for instance, ISDS, this ability of foreign investors to sue governments, that's just in the text of the agreement. Parliament doesn't get to vote on whether that's included or excluded. And that means that the whole text can limit future government action in various ways. So the first thing that we're asking for, and this is very important, I think, is at the end of the negotiating process, the text should be released for public and parliamentary discussion before the decision to sign it is made by or recommended by Cabinet. We want the text to be released before it's signed or decided to be signed by Cabinet. The second point is that we want more involvement by Parliament. And what that means is that we believe that Parliament should actually vote on the whole text, not just the implementing legislation. And we have consulted, and various constitutional experts have made submissions to this committee and to previous investigations of this kind, like Professors Geoffrey Lindell, George Williams and Toomey, etc. And they agree that there's no constitutional barrier to Cabinet actually referring its ability to sign trade agreements to Parliament so that Parliament can vote on the whole agreement, and then it goes back to Cabinet, if it's approved, for them to do the technical signing process. And this actually occurs in the Westminster systems in UK and Ireland. And I'll refer you to the quotes in our submission from those experts. There are growing numbers of examples of the public release of trade agreement texts before they're signed. Since 2003, World Trade Organisation texts, particularly in the trade and services negotiations, have been placed on the WTO website for discussion. The anti-counterfeiting trade agreement text was released in 2011 before it was signed, and the European Union, as well as having a consultation process during negotiations, in January made a specific commitment to release the completed negotiated text at the end of the process before it was signed, before it will be signed, in order to have both public and European parliamentary discussion. So there is a trend in this direction, and it's happened because people know that trade agreements are increasingly affecting their lives, and they want both public and parliamentary involvement. What we're recommending is essentially that Parliament be more involved throughout the process, that before trade negotiations begin, there be an open assessment and a report to Parliament about potential costs and benefits. There should be widespread consultation during the negotiations and with Parliament, and then the final text of the agreement should be released for public and parliamentary debate before it's signed, including in that process an independent assessment. We share the concerns about NIA processes, particularly the Korean one, but I've read many NIAs, and they always say it's a great agreement. So we need an independent assessment of the agreement as part of that public and parliamentary scrutiny, then a report back to Parliament through JSCOT, and then Parliament should vote on the whole agreement, not just the implementing legislation. I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that opening statement. And I just want to start off with the same question. So for 100 plus years, the country's been making agreements, the politicians have been voting on the enabling regulation or legislation. What's so broken now that we have to fix this system? Do you want to just hit a couple of points?
Well, the point I made just in my opening statement is that trade agreements now deal with a whole lot of issues which touch people's lives. They deal with medicine, they deal with copyright, they deal with food labelling, a whole lot of issues which they didn't deal with in the past.
Saying that hasn't been the case in the past?
No, they used to be mainly about reductions in tariffs. It's really only since 1994 that we've had, for instance, the inclusion of intellectual property rights in trade agreements, and the same with medicines and patents, which are a subset of intellectual property rights. So if they are going to deal with matters which would normally be the subject of democratic open debate and domestic legislation, we argue that this is a very strong case for making trade agreements more open to the public and more involvement by Parliament.
So you're saying the effect of a trade agreement could be that a law could be applied to an Australian citizen?
Well, if we look at all the examples that have been given about the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, for example, that required very substantial changes to our copyright law, which increased the length of the copyright term, the penalties for breaching copyright, And there've actually been domestic reviews of copyright law which have recommended things which were the opposite of what happened in the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. If we'd just had our own process, domestic process of evaluating copyright law, we wouldn't have done what was in the US Free Trade Agreement. And you can argue the same things on patents on medicines. As Kim Weatherall said, there was a recent review of patents on medicines in Australia, and it recommended, in fact, that we should not enter into trade agreements that strengthen the rights of patent holders, and it criticised some of the measures that had already been taken in that regard, and said if we look at the whole thing on an evidence-based basis, then it's in Australia's benefit to have more competition in relation to the provision of medicines, not to extend monopoly rights and delay competition from cheaper generic medicines. Incidentally, it seems to me that that makes sense in terms, if you're talking about free trade agreements, why are we extending monopoly rights and calling it a free trade agreement?
Mm. Yeah, I don't think there's anything free about a lot of these agreements. Senator Bush-Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. Just specifically on the NIAs that you mentioned, who does the national interest analysis at the moment? For something like career or...
Well, my impression is that it is conducted by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. They may seek advice from other departments.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know exactly who the individuals are concerned.
So you said that they're all suggesting they're great agreements. Does that surprise you, given how politicised the process is around signing trade agreements and the power the executive has on these agreements? And ultimately, I'd like you to just state for the committee whether you think those NIAs are independent of the government and the executive.
Well, I've already said that I think the NIA process is inadequate because it's not independent, and what we are recommending is that there be, as the Productivity Commission recommended, and as a number of other parliamentary committees and so on have recommended, that there be an assessment by an independent body at the end of the trade agreement of the text of the trade agreement, and we're arguing it should be publicly released so that that assessment takes place before it's signed, so that that assessment of the costs and benefits of the agreement can actually feed into the decision about whether the agreement should be signed or not.
Do you think the J. Scott recommendations in relation to looking at the table documents around a trade deal are also independent of government?
Sorry, I'm not quite...
Do you believe that J. Scott goes through a process, the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties goes through a process of looking at the legislation around a new trade deal? Do you have a comment on whether those recommendations would be independent of the government's view on that particular trade deal?
Well, I think the J. Scott process, the main problem there is that they only get to look at the agreement after it's been signed and they can't change it. J. Scott has frequently made assessments which are quite critical of trade agreements. So in that sense, they have taken an independently critical position, but...
Have you seen one they haven't ratified though?
They usually, because J. Scott is a joint committee and the majority are government members, they usually recommend that the agreement go forward, that the legislation be passed through Parliament. There are dissenting reports in J. Scott, and sometimes J. Scott itself has made criticisms of aspects of the content of the agreement. But normally, J. Scott is handicapped by the fact that it can't actually change the text. The text has already been signed.
So by the time those criticisms have been made by J. Scott, there's nothing we as parliamentarians can do to change, except vote against the enabling legislation.
That's right, and that's why we're recommending that the text be released before it's signed, that there's an independent assessment, that the J. Scott review process take account of that independent assessment. I mean, there can be other parliamentary committees that look at it as well in that process. There have been Senate inquiries and so on. We're not saying J. Scott should be the only process, but we think J. Scott would be a lot better informed if it looked at the text of the agreement before it was signed, and if it had access to an independent assessment of the costs and benefits.
You said you've been covering this area for 20 years, Dr. Ranald. Do you get frustrated that over the years a number of these recommendations have already been made? And I know you've been you've participated in some of those inquiries, yet we've continued to see no change.
I do think now that there is more of a groundswell for change, and the overseas examples that I've pointed to show that it's not just happening in Australia and that governments are reacting to this groundswell. So I think the decision by the European Commission to release the text of the TTIP, the Transatlantic Agreement, before it's signed for public and parliamentary discussion, they made that decision in January this year after a very big public debate in Europe about the nature of that agreement for exactly the same reasons that that I mentioned in terms of the TPP, that it affects so many aspects of people's lives. So I do think that we have a chance now, with the public interest in these issues and the public debate, to make some changes. And the last lot of actual changes were made with the treaty process in 1996. There have been successive recommendations for more open and democratic processes, including by JSCOT itself, I might add. So I'm hoping that this is the moment when we can actually take this forward.
Do you think the issue is that these deals are highly politicised? I mean, you mentioned the JSCOT and NIA, and they were recommendations of earlier inquiries, such as Trick or Treaty, to improve transparency around trade processes, yet we're hearing evidence from people such as yourselves that they're not necessarily independent. I mean, is the issue ultimately that a Prime Minister in his Governor-General response speech says we're going to be the party that's going to be remembered for free trade deals, and they're trying to sign as many as possible in their first term in office? I mean, how do we depoliticise this issue?
Well, I don't think it's a matter so much of politicisation. It's a matter of having a clearer view, whatever government is in office, a clearer view about what Australia's national interest is and whether it's a good idea to enter negotiations in the first place and what should be the objectives of the negotiations. We think Parliament should be involved in that process from the beginning. I think that one of the reasons why agreements involving the US are so controversial is that the US itself has its own very clear, not only objectives, but they have a template which started with the North American Free Trade Agreement in 2004, and all the academic studies show this. And then each time they do a new trade agreement, whether it's bilateral or regional as the TPP is, they up the ante. I mean, with copyright, the standard was 50, they upped it to 70 in the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement and some others at that time. In the TPP, they're actually saying that in some circumstances it should be 90, the life of the author or the origin of the cinematic product plus 90. I mean, that is a doubling of what are essentially monopoly rights and rents paid to copyright holders over a period of 20 years. And the US is able to use its bargaining power to make these demands on other parties. Now, in most people's view, copyright experts and most ordinary people's view, that is not in the interests of Australia to agree to that. But because it's in the context of a trade negotiation, it can get traded off against something else. Now, we don't think we should be making our laws about copyrights, or even worse, about medicines, in that sort of context behind closed doors. We should be making our own decisions about domestic law on patents or copyright in Australia through an open process. And if they are going to be dealt with at all in trade agreements, then it should be a much more open process.
Just a philosophical question in relation to fair trade, because you represent the Fair Trade Network. Senator Back asked an interesting question earlier about why, if I could paraphrase him, why the WTO went off the rails, essentially. Can you give us your understanding of why agreements like the TPP and a number of bilateral deals have been proliferating after the WTO essentially came to a halt?
Well, the WTO has its own problems, and we've made submissions about changes to the WTO ourselves over the years, but the advantage that it has globally is that it does include most countries, including most of the poorer countries of the world, and it's supposed to operate by consensus. So that means it's a slow process, and that has its, downside. But the advantage is that there is some balance of negotiating forces. So there are the poorest countries in the world have a grouping which represents their interests. The emerging economies have groupings like the BRICS. It's a much more even-handed, if you like, power. I wouldn't call it even-handed. It's a less imbalanced power relationship than some of the regional or certainly bilateral agreements. And for that reason, when proposals are put up about things like extending patents on medicines, they're not agreed. The majority of parties don't agree to them. Now, I think that's positive, that the majority of parties in the WTO won't agree to endlessly extend copyright and patents. But if you look at it from another point of view, those demanding those extensions think that's a failure. I don't think that's necessarily a failure. But what has happened is that there's been a proliferation of bilateral and regional agreements. And I do think that often there's a much greater imbalance of power in those bilateral and regional agreements.
So just one last question, if you don't mind, Senator Back. It's been reported that President Obama had promised NGOs, for example, in the US, that the TPP would be a force for good on environmental standards and labour standards across the Asia-Pacific region. Yet our Finance Minister, Senator Cormann, said at estimates, as you'll probably be aware of, that these agreements aren't the platform for changing environmental standards or including environmental standards. Why do you think things such as, well, firstly, do you have hope that the TPP will have better environmental and binding environmental and labour standards? And is it feasible for trade deals, because it is in the terms of reference for this inquiry, is it feasible for these trade deals to include things such as binding agreements on the environment?
Well, our vision of fair trade is that trade agreements should contain protection for basic labour rights and that's internationally agreed labour rights through the International Labour Organisation and internationally agreed environmental standards, and that they should be enforceable in the same way that other chapters in trade agreements are enforceable through government-to-government disputes. That's the general way that trade agreements are enforceable. Now, at the beginning of the TPP process, it was said that that would be the case for the TPP, but we do know, again, from not just leaked documents, but from the general discussion that's generated, particularly in the US, that there still isn't agreement about those issues in the TPP. So we don't know whether there will be enforceable labour rights or enforceable environmental standards. We do know that there's been a lot of disagreement about it because different parties have written about their different views about it.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thank you again, Dr. Ranald. It's good to see you in front of the committee. I have been just going through the DFAT website, particularly as it does relate to the TPP agreement. So I'm just trying to come to an understanding. It is my understanding that there's been an extensive, and in fact still is an ongoing process, is there not, of consultation. In fact, I think one of the last things they say is the Australian Government continues to take all available opportunities to engage with stakeholders. Submissions can be made at any time. Australian negotiators are available for briefings and one-on-one meetings at your request. your organisation has availed itself of those
Yes, we have, and
opportunities?
we say that in our submission.
Yes.
We don't deny there's been opportunities to talk to DFAT,
Yes.
but as other witnesses have said, particularly now that we're getting towards the end of the process, this trade agreement's probably going to be 2,000 pages long
Yes.
of detailed legal agreement and propositions. And unless you can actually see the text or talk about the text in detail, it's very difficult to know, to make meaningful comments. And we do have regular meetings with DFAT, but they are not able to tell us in detail what is in the text or to show us the text, and that limits the level of consultation.
Yes. But
So most of our actual information has come from leaked documents or from industry commentary from organisations in the United States, for example, who have seen the text, and from industry lobby groups like the pharmaceutical industry who lobby very hard for things like increased intellectual property rights. They're quite public about what they're lobbying for.
Now one of the understandings I had was that at the end of each negotiating round, there would be some sort of an update on the negotiations that have been undertaken during that round. Is that something that you
It hasn't happened after every round, no, but it has, on average for the TPP, DFAT has held general briefings about twice a year.
Right.
And then, and there might have been, say, 6 negotiating rounds in a year.
Yes.
And then if, on request, they will, by telephone or whatever, answer questions if you have specific questions, or sometimes they will organise, say, a meeting about health issues or patent rights or a
Right.
particular topic. But it's not happened after every round. no.
Right. And have you participated in any of those?
Yes.
And you've not been, have you been constrained by confidentiality clauses in those briefings?
We're asked, it's difficult to describe the status of those meetings. We're asked to keep details confidential, but we're not given many details.
Right.
So, as I said, we often get to a point where we ask a question and the response will be, well, we can't really answer that question because it's too detailed.
Sure.
They're not open to the media, for example.
No.
So the media isn't invited to those briefings.
Right. So they're basically then, are they briefings of people who have expressed or who are known to have a special interest in the topic under discussion?
Yes, although they're a little bit more broader than that because I'm not sure. Sometimes they're advertised on by DFAT
Yes.
to a wider audience.
So just the two that you were discussing with Senator Wish-Wilson, Labor. Australia supports Labor provisions in the TPP that promote internationally recognised fundamental labour rights. The TPP will endeavour to set a new benchmark that will benefit workers across the region by promoting compliance with internationally recognised labour rights and effective enforcement of labour laws. Now, you've just, I think, made the comment that not all the players, not all the participants are in agreement, perhaps, with those principles. But can we be satisfied, in your mind, that is where Australia stands? And even though there might be others in other countries who might not.
Are you reading from the current information on the DFAT website?
Yep, I think I am, yes. I only opened it half an hour ago, so I imagine I am. And then also too in the environment, TPP will include the most extensive environment chapter Australia has negotiated as part of a free trade agreement, high levels of environmental protection in the 12 countries, seeking commitments in areas where trade disciplines can help address those challenges.
Well, that, again, both of those statements are at a very general level.
Yes, they are.
And
I accept that.
You would need to see the detail of the text to know whether, A, the standards were high and B, whether they were enforceable. I don't think the word enforceable, was the word enforceable used in the Labor, in relation to Labor commitments?
To endeavour to set a new benchmark that will benefit workers, and Australia supports Labor provisions. My expectation would be this is Australia's position.
Yes, but there's a big difference. Again, Australia has signed many trade agreements which don't have labour or environment chapters.
Yes.
Most of the ones we have signed, if they have them, like the Korea FTA, they're motherhood statements and they're not enforceable. They're not included in the
But it won't, in that
enforceability
particular
of
case,
the
it wouldn't
agreement.
deteriorate Australia's position, would it? I remember we negotiated it. We discussed at some length the Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement as it related to...
Neither the labour chapter nor the environment chapter in the Korea Free Trade Agreement are enforceable.
Right.
They are just statements. We will do our best endeavours
Sure.
to do this.
But we would
that
expect
makes
they
them
would...
different from all the other chapters in the trade agreement which are enforceable, legally enforceable.
Yes.
So we believe that the commitments on labour and environment should also be legally enforceable.
Yes, right, thank you. Thank you for that. Thanks, Chair.
Just on that point though, Chair, if I could clarify for the committee, obviously you have state-to-state dispute settlements and you have investor-to-state. So in this situation we may have where corporations have a right to sue based on a number of different criteria, but there'd be no right to enforce, for example, binding agreements on deforestation or sustainable fishing or whatever it happens to
Well,
be.
as I said, in the case of the TPP, that was promised, but so far as we know, it has not yet been agreed that they will be enforceable or what the standards will be exactly.
Good.
So if you could just in a couple of minutes we got left, so we have been making treaties for a very long time as a trading nation. You've listed some of the things that have changed in the last few, decade and a half, I suppose. So can you point to any real failures in the making of, the Korean Free Trade Agreement, Japanese? Is there anything that really stands out from your organisation's view that is a failure of getting a good outcome for Australia?
Well, we made detailed submissions on the Korea Free Trade Agreement. We were very concerned that it does include ISDS, the ability of corporations to sue governments, so that was one of our major concerns. We were very concerned about the copyright provisions along the lines that Dr Weatherall talked about. We expressed our grave concern that neither the labour chapter nor the environment chapter were legally enforceable, despite the rest of the agreement being legally enforceable. And we were also concerned that the tariff reductions on Australia's part seemed unbalanced compared with what the Korean government committed to. So most of our tariffs went immediately to zero, and the Korean tariff reductions were things like going from 30% to 20% over a 10-year period. So we did think there was an imbalance there as well. And given that the government was saying that was the main benefit from the agreement, we felt we had to comment on that as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr Ranald.